really flabbered.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on this urgent debate around the Crafar land sales. I think this debate does raise some critical issues about economic policy for New Zealand, and one of the critical issues is what to do about land. It is certainly true that the previous Labor government sold a very large, or approved rather, a large amount of land into overseas ownership, the figure of 660,000 hectares. It's certainly true that this current government has approved about 230,000 hectares since it's come into office. Since then, I'm pleased to say that Labor has had a change of heart about this issue, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. It's very strange that the Minister should suggest that a party could change its mind and that's a bad thing. Actually, it's a good thing. And what's fundamentally changed in the global environment around land is that food security is becoming a critical issue globally. If you don't understand that fundamental reality of green economics, then you won't understand this debate. Because the fundamental reality is that all around the world there's enormous pressure on food security and there's enormous pressure on the food prices. So we've seen big spikes in food prices, and that has led many countries and governments and corporations to focus on buying up land. And so globally we've seen the big land grab, as it's called. Now we think, and the numbers are a little bit hard to get, but probably in the last decade we've seen about 2 million square kilometres of land has been grabbed. And that's been grabbed by governments like the South Korean government, it's been grabbed by corporations. There's a lot of the Gulf states are very focused on food security, so they've been buying up very large amounts of land. So all of those governments and corporations are very focused on buying land in order to maintain food security. It is a global phenomenon, and you can read about it in New Scientist, so I can't imagine Maurice Williamson would ever read a science magazine, but you can read about it, and you can read about it there. Fred Pearce wrote an article about it where you can read about the global land grab that's underway at the moment. And that is happening because of resource constraints. So resource constraints, one of the fundamental ideas within green economics, is one of the key drivers with what's happening to land prices and food globally. The other one, of course, is climate change. As the effect of climate change starts to happen, what we're seeing is pressure on food-producing systems and access to water. And, of course, as global populations grow and get more wealthy, having land which can produce food is becoming more and more valuable. And this is a global phenomenon. And New Zealand land tends to be more expensive than other land in other countries. So our land hasn't been at the top of the list for the land grabbing, but there has been a significant amount of land that has been purchased in New Zealand. And of course the Crafar Farms deal is just a part of it. And so we need to actually take into account that global reality when we're setting our policy around foreign investment in land. Do we think that it is the right strategy to allow our land to fall into overseas investment? I would argue that it is a very poor strategy. Effectively, this land is the goose that lays the golden egg. And our economic strategy, I think a smart green economic strategy, is to sell golden eggs rather than sell the goose. However, the government, for short-term economic reasons, wants to sell the goose. So they're saying, how do we fund the current account deficit? There's only two ways to fund the current account deficit. You either borrow more or you sell assets to overseas owners. And what this National Party government wants to do is sell more assets into overseas owners in order to fund the current account deficit, and they want to borrow more. And we've seen government borrowing has gone through the roof because this government has borrowed a huge amount, one of the biggest borrowing governments we've had in generations, actually. And so in order to fund the current account deficit, what the government proposes to do is to sell off the remaining assets. Now, we've sold off large amounts of capital assets. When you think of the foreign dominance of the New Zealand Stock Exchange, one of the last great assets that we can sell in order to pay for the current account deficit is the land. And so what this government is doing is saying, yes, open door, you can buy the land, and that's how we're going to fund the current account deficit. I would argue that that is a very, very short-term strategy. It is a much more sensible strategy to hold on to the land and use that as the base for our economy. That is, sell the produce from the land, sell the golden eggs, rather than selling the goose. But this government is intent, it would appear, to go down the track of selling more and more land into overseas ownership. Now, Now that is part of a global trend, and so it's not surprising. All around the world, governments are grappling with exactly this problem. Governments like ours, which have large amounts of land in Africa and elsewhere, when large foreign corporations, in this case it's a Chinese government-backed corporation, Shanghai Pengjin, wants to buy food-producing land in order to send food back to their domestic market. And so that has produced enormous tension in legislatures like this one all around the planet. That's why the Greens have moved a bill in my name, to actually restrict the purchase of land into overseas ownership. So we would amend the Overseas Investment Act so that sensitive land, which is defined within the Act as 5 hectares or more of rural land, you cannot allow that land to go into overseas ownership. It's a simple amendment to the Overseas Investment Act, and the purpose is very simple, and that is to keep the land in New Zealand ownership, because that is a fundamental aspect. Now, during this debate, of course, the government has used personal attacks to attack anyone that disagrees with them. So we've just had Maurice Williamson, the minister, attacking people on the basis that they're migrants to New Zealand. And so the minister attacked me because I'm a migrant to New Zealand and said somehow that means that I'm not allowed to speak in this debate, that I don't have a valid position. Well, I would say to the minister, I'm proud to be a migrant in New Zealand, and I would say to all other migrants, you should be proud. Don't listen to the National Party. When the National Party attacks people for being migrants in New Zealand, when David Bennett attacks people for being migrants in New Zealand, don't listen to them. You are welcome here. We welcome migrants to New Zealand. We're very pleased to have a society where migrants are welcome. And we believe that land should be kept affordable so that every person who lives here, a permanent resident or a citizen, can afford to buy land here. Because what will happen is, if we have an open door approach to foreign ownership of our land, is that the price of land will get to a point where most New Zealanders cannot afford to buy it. The family farmer will become a figment of history, an aspect of history, because family farmers won't be able to afford land. If you look at the most recent case that we're debating today, the Shanghai Pengjin case around the Crafar farms, the Shanghai Pengjin had such deep pockets that they could outbid Michael Fay. Now, Michael Fay is an extremely wealthy New Zealander, and he was outbid by this Chinese government-backed corporation. The reason is that the Chinese government has more than $2 trillion $2 trillion US dollars, which they're trying to turn into assets. Because sitting on US dollars when the US government has the ability to print unlimited amounts of dollars is a very poor strategy. So the Chinese government and other governments very wisely are trying to turn those cash assets into real assets. And buying up land is a critical part of that strategy. So that's why they're able to outbid people like Michael Fay, and they'll certainly be able to outbid family farmers. So if there are family farmers who have aspirations to buy their own farm, you will be outbid by foreign corporations, because as land becomes more and more valuable, then they will focus on buying up food-producing land, particularly food-producing land with access to water. That is the fundamental reality. And that's because we live within a resource-constrained world where food-producing land will only become more and more and more valuable. And so large corporations and foreign governments will target food-producing land because they are concerned about the price of food and food security. And that's why we think it's essential that we protect that land. It is a fundamental economic strategy, but it's also a fundamental social justice strategy. People should be able to afford to buy the land in the country that they live. If the price of land is driven so high that even Michael Fay, one of the wealthiest New Zealanders, can't afford to purchase the land, is outbid by Shanghai Pengjin, an overseas corporation backed by a foreign government, if that happens, then it means that ordinary family farmers won't be able to afford to purchase land. And that is what the National Party is proposing. What the National Party is proposing with their strategy of open door is that ordinary family farmers won't be able to buy land in New Zealand. And our view is that ordinary family farmers should be allowed to buy land in this country. And we can only achieve that if we restrict overseas ownership of land, because the overseas ownership of land will drive the price out of the reach of ordinary New Zealanders, and it will only be the large conglomerates, large international corporations, or large government-backed organisations, the Gulf states are very active in this space, who are going around the planet and purchasing land. Now, if you are, and clearly I have no idea whether National is aware of this or not, but this is a global phenomenon being driven by resource constraints. So the smart green economic strategy is to hang on to these assets. Hang on to the land, because food-producing land over time will only become more valuable. It is intimately connected to New Zealand's economic advantage overseas, which is our clean, green and safe. Clean, green and safe is fundamental to the New Zealand brand. It's why we're selling large amounts of dairy into China at the moment. And so maintaining land, maintaining it in New Zealand ownership is fundamental to New Zealand's long-term economic future. That's why I've got my bill before the House, and that's why I'd urge all members to vote for it.
Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. New Zealand First has consistently